We've come to the end of our animal magnetism book. We finished all the chapters by William Lang, and now we just need to get through the supplement by the Reverend Chauncey Townshend. And Wikipedia says about this guy, he was a 19th century English poet, clergyman, mesmerist, collector, dilettante, and hypochondriac. That last part, it doesn't seem like a very nice thing to say about someone as one of the main things they're remembered for. There's no citation. We have a big citation needed on that one. But I guess we'll have to take their word for it. He was close friends with Charles Dickens, and he was one of the main people, along with Dr. John Elliotson, who popularized animal magnetism in both America and England. He got it trending, I guess you could say. And this supplement is a preview from his new book on some latest developments in animal magnetism or mesmerism. So let's dive in. Supplement: New Facts in Mesmerism by the Reverend Chauncey Townshend. Prefixed to the new edition of his Facts in Mesmerism and never before published in the United States. A new edition of the Facts in Mesmerism having been called for, I would here answer a question which has frequently been asked me, namely, whether since I gave the facts to the world my opinions on the subject, which they illustrate, have undergone any modification or change. My reply to this inquiry is that the views of mesmerism expressed in this work remain in my mind essentially the same. As they were not slightly embraced, so have I found no cause lightly to abandon them. Whatever slight difference between my present and past mode of regarding mesmerism may exist, should rather be called an extension than a change. Of course, while pursuing researches over a territory so vast, so varied as this, my knowledge of its features has become enlarged, and I could now perhaps fill in more definitely tracts of the new district, which I had but broadly sketched out before. But is it not true that for common reference we often prefer those maps of a country in which only the principal roads and most important points of interest are laid down, to those which at first sight puzzle the eye and scatter the attention by their multitude of dots and their complexity of lines? Besides, it must be recollected that my object has never been to paint with curious minuteness a Dutch portrait of that singular state called mesmeric, but to illustrate broadly certain important conditions of man, not for their own sake, but on account of the still more important views of man's endowments and capacities to which they plainly beckon on the mind. If I have succeeded in demonstrating even to a few, by means of mesmeric phenomena, the predominance of spirit over matter, in drawing attention from visible shadows to things which, though unseen, are the changeless substances from which those shadows fall and are projected earthwards, in pointing to the existence, even in this state of being, of a germ of immortality which waits its ulterior development in an ulterior world, then indeed are the highest objects of that which I regard as a sacred mission fulfilled. The metaphysical deductions which may be drawn from mesmeric phenomena have always appeared to me in themselves to constitute a sufficient and a noble answer to the inquiry, in what can mesmerism contribute to the welfare or knowledge of man? The light which this agency throws upon the mysteries of our nature, upon some of the profoundest truths of religion, the indications which it alone presents of a possible separation between soul and body, and of the predominating powers of the former, must ever vindicate the sincere inquirer into its laws from the charge of trifling with an idle subject, granting that he should confine himself to half his theme, and decline touching upon the relief which, in a medical point of view, mesmerism is capable of affording to the evils of suffering humanity. But it is the peculiar happiness of mesmerism not to be forced to rely upon any one solitary and partial claim to notice and consideration. Its roots are cast deeply and extensively into the general ground of humanity. Where the metaphysician leaves it, the man of science may take it up, and when science has gathered in its store of valuable facts illustrative of all her noblest theories, it can still afford an ample harvest to him who would practically ameliorate the condition of his fellow beings. If it fail to win the heart of the materialist from his barren creed by its revelations of mind as the only real source of motion, as all indeed that can be named power, if vainly it preach to the skeptical or the careless of truth, righteousness, and judgment to come, it ought at least to recommend itself to every friend of man by the palpable benefits it is calculated to bestow in cases of disease which are either unaffected by or opposed to the action of other remedies. That this pretension, as we will modestly call it, on the part of mesmerism, to rank at least as a means of cure, should not universally prevail to win for it a patient and unbiased trial and examination, it is indeed a proof of the force of prejudice to turn us even from our habitual ways of proceeding. I can well understand that mesmerism, reasoning of things beyond the tomb, should meet with contumely or neglect, for we seem indeed to be so constituted that the present and the physical lord it over the future and the intangible, so that a power professing to heal diseases will interest men generally more than the most striking revelations regarding their moral destiny, and it may be reasonably doubted whether our Redeemer's Sermon on the Mount made anything like the impression which the healing of the leper at its foot produced upon the assembled multitudes. But that mesmerism, proclaiming, "I can cure," should be coldly and partially received does, I own, move me to wonder. Ordinarily, all that holds out even a hope of relief to any ailment whatever, whether real or fancied, is welcomed with a blind rage and stupid credulity. Every new name of every old quack remedy is certain to evoke a crowd of self-devoted persons who are most ready to try on their own poor bodies the efficacy of the nostrum. In the very teeth of verdicts that denounce the drug as murderous, the fond disciples of a favorite pill will yet continue to obey the voice of the inventor that says, "The more you take, the better. Id est for my own pocket," and will greedily swallow the favorite boluses by 50s and by 100s. In the case of mesmerism alone, the most startling benefits, the most alluring promises on the one side, persecution even, and the anathemas of the diplomatized on the other, have all failed to stimulate the public mind into anything like desire or enthusiasm. Perhaps even so it is well. All slowly acquired possessions are the surest, and that which owes nothing to the breath of popular applause may consider itself independent of popular fickleness. The part that now remains to the friends of mesmerism is, by truth and sobriety, to win their way into the territory of public belief, where every step is grudgingly accorded, and gradually to persuade men to their own benefit by setting before them unceasing examples of the curative powers of the distrusted agency. It is in this sphere of its operation especially that my experience has become enlarged, and as I have elsewhere sufficiently insisted on the metaphysical importance of mesmerism, I would here confine myself to stating a few facts relative to its remedial energy, which have either fallen under my own observation, or have reached me through unsuspected sources. I have watched the effects of mesmeric treatment upon a suffering friend who was dying of that most fearful disorder, lumbar abscess. Unfortunately, through various hindrances, mesmerism was not resorted to till late in the progress of the disease, so that, of course, that it should effect a cure was out of the question. It should ever be held in remembrance that mesmerism does not profess to work miracles. It cannot restore a decayed bone to its integrity or recreate a missing part, but it can benefit even where it cannot save. And how much is it to say of a power that it is remedial even where not curative, and that in cases where it fails to rekindle life, it can smooth the passage to the grave and mitigate the horrors of physical pain. This I have gratefully witnessed in the case of my suffering friend. He was at the time of the worst part of his illness residing near Innsbruck, and was fortunate enough to command the mesmeric services of Dr. Ennemoser, the author of several high and useful works on mesmerism, a man whose experience in this science is fully equaled, as it ever ought to be in medical men, by his knowledge of therapeutics in general. I have no hesitation in saying that under God the life of my friend R.T. was prolonged at least 2 months by the action of mesmerism. The improvement in all his symptoms from the date of the first experiment was too marked to be mistaken, or to be considered as the result of other causes. At the time the mesmerizing was undertaken, the patient was in a state of continuous fever, totally without appetite, and suffering almost constant pain from 13 wounds, which were partly the result of his disorder, partly of abrasion from his being nearly hours in a reclining posture, either in bed or on a sofa. His thirst was great, his tongue white and dry, and his pulse hurried. Rarely could he obtain an hour's continuous sleep at night. After the first mesmerizing, he slept better than he had done for weeks, and in 3 or 4 days the continuous fever was exchanged for a hectic attack which came on periodically about 6 o'clock in the evening, but rarely lasted more than 2 hours. The furred and loaded tongue became pure as an infant's, the appetite excellent, and so continued until within 3 days of the closing struggle. The pulse also sank into a calm state, which was only disturbed by the recurrence of the evening hectic. In all points, the improvement was so remarkable that everyone about the patient thought that, had mesmerism been earlier resorted to, the patient's life must have been preserved. But the abscess had already too deeply affected the bones of the back and hip, and had extended too near the femoral artery to be checked by human means, or even by those almost superhuman aids which mesmerism may be said to afford. Dr. Ennemoser attended his patient always at one certain hour, 2 o'clock, every day. During the manipulations, the sufferer invariably slept, but not always with the same degree of intensity. Even in the lighter stages of mesmeric slumber, it was remarkable that R.T. could bear to have his right leg and thigh moved out of their customary position, and even somewhat roughly handled, whereas at other times an accidental touch upon those parts would cause him to shriek with agony. Of course, as the object of the mesmerizing was solely the patient's relief, no experiments were tried or questions asked which might in any way distress or fatigue him. But Dr. Ennemoser in general, after the sleep-waking was induced, would inquire of R.T. how the simple medicine he was taking agreed with him, if it should be continued or left off, increased or diminished, also what diet he should observe, etc. These questions were always perfectly well answered, and the patient subsequently retained no collection of them or of having spoken. I hasten to obviate a remark which may here be made, namely that perhaps the medicine I have mentioned was the efficient cause of R.T.'s improvement. To this I reply that Dr. Ennemoser did, for a long period, order no other medicine than that which the patient had been taking some time before the mesmerizing was begun. This was merely a slight infusion of quinine, called in the part of the world where we were quinine tea. But there is no occasion to insist even upon this point. The power of mesmerism was sufficiently demonstrated where no other cause could possibly interfere with its simple unmixed agency, I mean in the relief of pain. At all times and in any moment the mesmeric passes either soothed or arrested the patient's sufferings, and having once been mesmerized by Dr. Ennemoser, he was susceptible to the mesmeric actions of those with whom he lived in daily relationship. His brother especially, who had come from England to attend his deathbed, could exert this influence over him, and had the ability to quiet his paroxysms of pain, or to make him sleep at moments when, under ordinary circumstances, any approach to slumber would have been impossible. What a valuable power was this! As any attempts at opiates increased the fever and brought on slight delirium, let anyone imagine what untold treasures resided in the simple motions of the hand, which calmed the thrill of agony and gave repose to throbbing yet exhausted nature. They who have heard, as I have heard, the dreadful shrieks, the sounds, more resembling the bellowing of a wild animal than the intonations of a human voice, which are wrung from the poor sufferer, and that sufferer a much-loved friend, under that most horrible, most appalling malady, the lumbar abscess, they and they alone can appreciate the almost overpowering thankfulness which swells the heart in return for a gift that in a few moments causes the shrill cry to shrink into a tremulous murmur, that murmur again to become an almost inarticulate sob, and that sob to die at length away into the blessed stillness of a deep, restoring slumber. Oh, we may reason and reason about the truth of mesmerism, the more or the less of faith that we may bestow upon its wondrous yet shifting phenomena. But in such a case as this we feel, and in a childlike spirit, acquiesce in the benefit which we are unable to analyze. The heart is wise, as Southey has beautifully said, and here at least is demonstration in its glow of gratitude that this power is of God. These tranquilizing effects of mesmeric influence were manifested even unto the end of my dear friend's life. Yet he owed a deeper debt than this to mesmerism. It had reclaimed him from the hardest infidelity. Of a singular organization, R.T., the most amiable of human beings, approached the nearest to an atheist of anyone I ever met with. He seemed to want the very faculty which says at once, a God must be. But in his last illness, then it was that a new principle supplied the defect of the original nature more strikingly than if that nature had from the beginning appeared full of holy veneration. Who that then saw him leaning over his Bible as he sat for an hour or two in the evening, propped up by pillows on every side, calm even under the attack of periodical fever, triumphing over mortal infirmity and pain, rejoicing while we inwardly mourned, and whispering patience and comfort to all around him, who that beheld this strength made perfect in weakness but must have said, the hand of heaven is here. And this faith, this wondrous patience, this holy comfort springing out of tears were, as he himself told me, attributable under divine providence to mesmerism. From having seen mesmeric phenomena to which he could not refuse his assent, he was led step by step to recognize the mighty truth of spirit predominant over matter, consequently of a ruling spirit creating and sustaining all things. He who sees and ministers to the spiritual wants of all his reasoning creatures had adapted this remedy to the peculiar and fearful disease of the intellect under which R.T. had labored. And touchingly he said to me, I rejoice that mesmerism should be the last remedy tried upon me, that it should prove successful in calming my pains, because it was the first thing that, through God's blessing, relieved me from the worse evil of an unbelieving heart. And so, praying and praising God, and grateful for mesmerism, the gift of God, his spirit was loosed from its earthly bonds at the very moment when, after a severe paroxysm of pain, his brother was mesmerizing him, as he thought, into the calmest slumber. In connection with the relief which mesmerism afforded to the last hours of my suffering friend, was another remarkable instance of the beneficial effects of the agency in question. The surgeon, who attended R.T. in a purely surgical capacity, was an intelligent man, possessed not only of much skill in his immediate profession, but of considerable medical knowledge. Having frequently witnessed the power of the mesmeric passes to calm R.T., even under the severest paroxysms of pain, Herr Lorenz requested me to give him some instructions in the mesmeric art, which he purposed occasionally to employ should a case to which the agency might seem applicable occur in his practice, amongst the neighboring poor, many of whom he attended gratuitously. One day he came to me full of pleasure and excitement, and related that he had had extraordinary success with mesmerism in a case which for some days had baffled his medical efforts and had given him considerable uneasiness. The patient was a young man, a poor laborer's son, who was suffering under the worst form of typhus fever, and had been for a long period without sleep, talking incessantly, in a state of constant delirium. After about half an hour's mesmerization, the young man ceased talking, and soon after fell into a calm and critical slumber. This circumstance so much astonished the youth's grandfather, who was at the time in the patient's room, the common room indeed of all the family, that he retreated behind the stove to mutter Ave Marias and Pater Nosters in order to exorcise the evil one, who alone, as the old man thought, herein reasoning no worse than many a pious Protestant, could have possibly produced such a rapid change for the better. Fortunately, his holy adjurations were insufficient to chase the kindly spirit that was calming and healing his poor grandson, and the young man awoke from the long and refreshing slumber which mesmerism had induced to an amended state and to the possession of his senses. Under continued mesmeric treatment, the patient recovered his strength and health, as Herr Lorenz informed me, more rapidly than is usual with persons who have been similarly affected. A brother of the young man, and the grandfather, now fell ill of the typhus, the infection of which, being in the same chamber with the invalid, they could scarcely escape. In these latter cases, Herr Lorenz assured me the disorder was robbed of its horrors by a timely resource to mesmerism, the employment of which was no longer suspiciously viewed by the old man. Indeed, by a common reaction of feeling, he had for some time transferred the miracles of mesmerism from the enemy of mankind's account to the credit of the Blessed Virgin. That the grandfather, who was 83 years of age, should have recovered speedily from this malignant fever with scarcely any other remedy than mesmerism, for in all the cases but little medicine was given, is another proof of the curative powers of this influence. The instances of the utility of mesmerism that have been detailed to me by foreign mesmerizers, some of whom are medical men, others not, are far too numerous to form part of a work. They would, if duly set down, constitute a work in themselves. I shall therefore only avail myself of the testimony touching the benefits of mesmerism of one or two persons on whose accuracy, from the coincidence of personal observation, I can place the firmest reliance. Dr. Ennemoser has assured me that he has successfully employed mesmerism, either alone or conjointly with other remedies, in almost every ailment to which the human constitution is liable, but more especially where it was chiefly desirable to excite a healthy action in the nerves and brain. He considered this as the one appointed remedy for epilepsy, and declared that he had cured by it several cases of madness. Dr. Wilde of Bern informed me that by mesmerizing a lady suffering under periodical fits of St. Vitus's dance, at the time when the affection used to come on, he succeeded in putting off the attack every day to a later hour until its recurrence was altogether prevented. He also related to me a most interesting case of another lady, in the last extremity, under an attack of the iliac passion, whom he supported in his arms, every moment expecting her dissolution, when the happy thought came like an inspiration to his mind, "Try mesmerism." He did so, and the relief was immediate, the spasmodic action subsided and the patient's life was preserved. During a residence at Dresden, I had the pleasure of hearing many authentic particulars of mesmeric cures from Count Zapari, a nobleman in one of the oldest families in Hungary, who has devoted his fortune, time, and talents to the exercise of mesmerism for the relief of disorders alone. I have seldom witnessed a more touching festival than was a public breakfast given to this gentleman by the friends of those persons whom he had either benefited or cured by mesmeric means. Many of the patients, now restored to health, were present at the table, and many of their relatives rose one by one to return thanks to the noble mesmerizer for the good which, under divine providence, he had done to those who were dear to them. One aged man spoke a few grateful words, but his voice faltered, and tears choking his utterance, he was forced to sit down in a silence which was more eloquent than speech. It was for the preservation of his only daughter, snatched by mesmerism from the very brink of the grave, that he desired to express his gratitude. A young lady who sat next to me at breakfast, a charming person, well known in the higher circles of Dresden, gave me a most interesting account of her own restoration to the blessings of health by the mesmeric aid of Count Zapari. For 2 years, she told me, she had been unable to rise from her bed or scarcely to move her limbs from nervous paralysis. At present, she said, I can walk, ride, dance as much as I will, and many persons here who knew my former state will scarcely believe in my identity with the poor bedridden creature that excited everybody's pity. Some who meet me out walking stare at me and start as if they had seen a ghost. Not indeed that I look much like one at the present time, a remark in which I fully coincided. Indeed, the peculiarly blooming appearance of this young lady so much belied all past suffering that till I entered into a conversation with her, I never dreamed that she could have been a mesmeric patient. The efficient cause of her cure, this lady declared to me, was a mesmeric sleep which lasted a fortnight, of the events of which she positively assured me she had no manner of recollection. Yet from the testimony of her parents and of those who were about her, during the period of the slumber, she could not doubt that she had in this time spoken, taken nourishment, and beheld objects, although her eyes were closed. Such lengthened mesmeric trances as this were frequently, as I heard from Count Zapari himself and from others of his patients, produced by him in certain cases, and were a powerful means of restoration to health. Not, as the Count assured me, that he labored at producing any such effect. On the contrary, he believed, and Dr. Chapelain in Paris told me he thought the same thing, that the mesmeric sleep was by no means an indispensable condition of mesmeric benefit. Many of his patients, he said, having got well under daily mesmerizings without having experienced any drowsiness or any extraordinary symptom whatever. His great desire was to leave nature free, to select such means of renovation as should be most suited to her exigencies, and to follow where she guided, not himself to lead the way, and to concentrate his thoughts as much as possible upon the single simple idea of doing good to the patient. But where the trance occurred, as it did mostly in exhausted yet irritable temperaments, the Count considered that this was the one thing wanting to restore the equilibrium of the constitution, and to enable nature to recover her tone by a prolonged repose. There were instances in Dresden of this mesmeric condition having endured not only weeks but months, and hours with beneficial results. That Count Zapari should, as it were, involuntarily cause this effect, so rare to be produced by other mesmerizers, is a proof of that which I have always believed, namely, that to each individual belongs a mesmeric action as peculiar and as individual as his own character. Count Zapari certainly possesses great mesmeric energy, being able to mesmerize many persons in the course of the day without fatigue to himself. on the virtues of mesmerized water. Both Count Zipari and Dr. Ennemoser laid great stress, and I have certainly, in the case of my friend R.T., witnessed its soothing effects. I have also observed mesmerized water intensify the state of sleep-waking, and I have seen a patient of Count Zipari, a little girl of 13 years of age, suffering under derangement of the nervous system, after she had drunk a small quantity of mesmerized water. That mesmerism should enter readily into combination with water, and be long retained by it, I can readily believe, for I have seen my own somnambulists, especially A.M., select the glass of water I had mesmerized from among 5 or 6 others not mesmerized, a full quarter of an hour after I had held the glass in my hand. In accordance also with this remark are the observations of Dr. Wilson of the Middlesex Hospital, who, in an interesting work on the effects of mesmerism upon animals, has declared that the mesmeric influence is more quickly and easily conveyed through the medium of water to fish than it is by the air to the apparently more sensitive tribes of nature. According to this author, some fish newly caught and placed in a large tub of water, over which mesmeric passes were made, were soon observed to rise to the surface and to follow the hand of the mesmerizer in whatever direction it moved. Again, I was present at Dresden at a lecture on galvanism, during which several fish in a glass globe were stunned and apparently killed by a galvanic shock. After the lecture, I went up to look at these fish, and struck by a sudden desire to make an experiment, I began to mesmerize the water in which they were. To my own surprise, for if I had thought to have produced an effect, I by no means expected one so rapid and so striking, the fish soon showed symptoms of reviving, and in a short time, during which I persevered in the mesmeric passes, and occasionally dipped my fingers lightly in the water, 5 out of the 6 that had been stunned, and lay floating on their backs, recovered their natural position and accustomed motions. The lecturer watched my proceedings with great interest, and assured me that under ordinary circumstances the fish would have remained at least an hour longer in a torpid state. Sometimes, indeed, he said, they never recovered from the effects of the galvanic shock. Several intelligent persons, who had not yet left the lecture room, witnessed this experiment, and declared themselves convinced that the resuscitation of the fish was really consequent upon it. These facts, relative to the ready alliance of mesmerism with water, and of the restorative powers of the agency when conveyed through that medium, I have here detailed in order to raise the question whether mesmerized water may not be employed more frequently than it now is, and with a rational hope of advantage in the mesmeric treatment of disorders. In England, not less than on the continent, opportunities have been afforded me of gathering evidence respecting the good that mesmerism has effected. I have accompanied Dr. Elliotson in his visits to such patients as he was treating by mesmerism, and have listened to many an artless expression of gratitude poured out to him by persons of various classes for the important benefit they had derived from this calumniated remedy. One of the most eloquent of these was a respectable woman, with whom I found myself accidentally in the same room at Dr. Elliotson's, while waiting one day till he had leisure to see me. This person assured me that for years she had suffered a martyrdom from tic douloureux, to such an extent that when Dr. Elliotson first began to mesmerize her, she could not hold any cold substance, even an open book, unless it were previously warmed by a fire, near her face, without a paroxysm of pain, which would send her darting involuntarily from one end of the room to the other. Of course, the contact of the open air would have been unbearable torture to her. And now, she said, I walk every day, in all kinds of weather, to Dr. Elliotson's house without inconvenience, and instead of having to suffer many attacks of agony in an hour, I often pass a whole day without pain. There was something in my accidental meeting with this woman, in her earnest and natural story, in the utter absence of pretension to display, for she came quietly and without the world's knowledge to Dr. Elliotson's for the simple relief of her malady, which impressed me strongly. And this is only one case of many such. I am indebted to Mr. Wood, who has studied under Dr. Elliotson, and who also admits mesmerism into his medical practice, for having witnessed one of the most triumphant proofs of the power of this influence that can be conceived. It was in the case of a little boy, only 3 years of age, who was born an idiot, and who had distressed all those about him by incessant shrieking, especially during the night, in consequence of which his mother declared she could scarcely obtain any sleep or repose. The mother, a respectable person of the middling class, brought in the child, which appeared not larger than an infant of 15 months old, but no infant of that age, to whom the gift of reason was vouchsafed, ever presented that fearful absence of expression which, in the dropping lip and unmeaning eye, characterized this unhappy sufferer. At the time when Mr. Wood began the mesmerizing, the child was keeping up a sort of low moaning, and occasionally crying aloud in a strange and disagreeable tone of voice. It was also moving restlessly about in the mother's arms. After about 5 minutes' mesmerization, the change in the child's demeanor was most striking. There was no longer any moaning or restlessness, and the eyes had gained a human look that grew upon them till they began to close in slumber, which at the end of little more than 10 minutes was complete and of the deepest kind. At this time the countenance had lost everything that was unpleasant. It had even the remarking and attentive expression which so strongly distinguishes the mesmeric from common sleep, so that in gazing upon it one could now say, "There is mind here." About the eyelids especially was that singular look, so peculiar to mesmeric sleep-waking, as if the eye were looking through them to something beyond. I was allowed to test the depth of the child's slumber by rather rough methods, such as shaking it, shouting out loudly close to its ear, etc., but nothing disturbed its repose in the slightest degree. The arm taken up and suddenly left to itself fell like lead, and more lifelessly than in ordinary sleep, upon whatever arrested its descent. The mother now placed the child upon a bed, and assured me that it would sleep there quietly for several hours, and awake in a far more tranquil state than that in which I had first seen it. The improvement in the child's condition, since the time when the mesmerism was undertaken, she told me, consisted in the following particulars. The rest at night was now good, and for this blessing, she said, she could not be too grateful. They alone could appreciate it, who had known, like her, what it was to sit up night after night with a child in that fearful state of idiotism. By day, the paroxysms of crying and of convulsive motion had become less frequent, and of a milder character, and whereas formerly the child took no notice of anything whatever, it now began occasionally, and more especially on first awaking from mesmeric slumber, to show symptoms of being interested in various objects. But above all, there was an evident dawn of speech, and the words "Papa" and "Mama" were, however imperfectly, uttered. But before mesmerism was tried, nothing approaching an articulate sound had ever passed the child's lips. I do not instance this case as an evidence of the power of mesmerism to restore confirmed idiocy to reason, in other words, to work a miracle. The child was relieved, not cured, and is, I believe, an idiot still, though of a milder kind than formerly. Afflicted as he was with a radical disease of the brain, a perfect restoration of the mental functions was not to be looked for, but greater progress towards reason had perhaps been made, could Mr. Wood have concentrated his time and mesmeric power upon this one patient. But he was called out of town to attend upon an urgent case which occupied him for some weeks, just at the time when he was daily producing more remarkable effects upon the little idiot boy. This statement will probably nullify all that I have said regarding this extraordinary case. For extraordinary, I still deem it. Because, with most persons, not to cure is equivalent to doing nothing at all. But I must say a few words on this subject. Is mitigation of suffering nothing in this suffering world? Who are the persons who choose to deny the advantage of a remedy because it is not entirely curative? Certainly not those who are tortured by disease, nor their friends who witnessed that torture. It is the partisans of a system, the prejudiced, whose prejudices no attack of serious pain, neither of illness, has shaken, who, being in possession of health themselves, can very calmly imagine that a pang more or less is but of very trifling consequence, and that more especially any one pang rendered less by mesmerism must be treason to all that is regular and respectable in this world of words and forms. The utmost that the unprejudiced can wish such persons is a good harmless fit of the toothache, which shall rage just sufficiently to make them grateful for any remedy that shall even alleviate their torments, and, above all, send them to sleep. To me, the case of the idiot child, however stopping short of perfect relief, is deeply interesting in sundry points of view, as thus, to produce any mitigation of symptoms, any glimmering of reason, in a case of born idiotism, is more extraordinary than to effect a cure of delirium or mania springing from accidental causes. This partial triumph over organic defect shows mesmerism capable of proceeding to the verge of the possible, and of educing from certain elements all the favorable results of which those elements are susceptible. Hence, too, hopes, nay more, rational expectations are engendered, that a power capable of achieving this much under unfavorable circumstances would, under other and better combinations of events, effect still more, and yet again, that where organic obstructions to the working of the influence were less or null, the fullest success would crown the mesmerizer's efforts. Again, the fact of mesmerism, having been able to compose and so quickly bring into slumber a child of 3 years old, that child moreover an idiot, suffering under high irritation, is sufficient of itself to refute the opinion of those who would refer mesmeric effects to the delusions of the imagination. How wonderful, too, appears the action of a remedy which, while it tranquilizes the nervous system, arouses it also into a state of healthy activity. The child's intellect is stimulated, while its restlessness is calmed. This capacity of mesmerism to act pro re nata, to serve either as a calmant or a stimulant, according to the exigencies of the complaint which it is called in to combat, followed as it is in neither mode of its influence by heaviness or exhaustion, would alone give it the highest rank as a remedy, if we regard it as a remedy merely. In this point of view, how valuable appears its offices, how unmatched by those of any substance in the materia medica. Again, the direct correspondence of mesmerism with the nervous system gives it a marked superiority over all such grosser agents as must reach that delicate framework of life by a circuitous route. Of all remedies, this alone pours its benefits direct upon the very springs of sensation, and thus in cases of deafness and blindness, which depend on nervous weakness, and I believe there are more such affections referable to this cause than is generally suspected, we possess a subtle means of acting efficiently upon that fountainhead of the calamity to which neither drug nor couching needle can find its way. I have already mentioned, in the body of my work, a remarkable instance of a boy, all but totally blind, who recovered a high degree of vision not only during mesmerization, but for an hour or two after it. As a pendant to this case, I will here add that of a young lady, Miss G. of Lynn, who, from earliest infancy, has suffered under the misfortune of deafness so nearly absolute that she has never learned to articulate any sound by the ear, although she has been taught to speak, and to understand speaking by the eye taking cognizance of the motions of other persons' lips. This young lady is highly educated and accomplished, and both her own character and the position of her family utterly exclude any idea of deception, such as the world is so charitably apt to entertain in all cases of mesmeric wonder. Let it be also remarked that the deafness of the mesmerisee gave a value and an authenticity to all the phenomena she presented, impossible to be afforded by other patients possessing the full complement of their senses. For it is plain that Miss G at least could not be guided as to what she was to do, or exhibit by the casual remarks either of the mesmerizer or the bystanders. Moreover, she knew nothing whatever about mesmerism, save as a remedy that might benefit her hearing. The father, mother, and brother of this interesting patient being present, I proceeded in the usual manner to try the influence of mesmerism upon her. The steady glance of the eye soon caused hers to close, more quickly indeed, as may be presumed, than is commonly the case, from her attention being undistracted by any sound. The mesmeric passes rapidly completed the effect, and in about 10 minutes from the time when the experiment was begun, the patient was in a state of the calmest sleep-waking. Then followed all the customary evidences of this condition in their purest, and, for the reasons I have above mentioned, most indisputable form. The head and hands were attracted towards me, and followed all my changes of position. When I was touched by another person, when I ate or drank, there were sympathetic movements, which, had I ever doubted these phenomena before, would now have firmly established them in my mind. But I hasten to the principal fact, for the sake of which I have mentioned this case. Miss G, during the continuance of the mesmeric sleep, gave undoubted proofs, varying indeed with the varying susceptibility which always distinguishes mesmeric patients, of a wonderful development of auditory power. She answered short questions, such as, "Do you feel well? Do you wish to be awoke?" etc., with perfect justness of affirmative or negative. To the inquiry, "How do you like being mesmerized?" she distinctly responded, "Very much." Her father, desiring personally to test that she did not reply merely through seeing the motion of the lips, though indeed her eyes seemed perfectly shut, was put en rapport with her, and holding a pocket handkerchief before his mouth, said, quite in a low tone of voice, "Harriet, shall we take a walk today?" To this she immediately answered, "No, I would rather ride." After the patient was restored to her normal state, Mr. G repeated the same question to her in exactly the same manner in which it was put before, and Miss G was totally unable to catch the slightest indication of what was said. I much regret that multiplied engagements prevented me from following up this most interesting case. Miss G was afterwards frequently mesmerized by her brother, but he was never able to throw her into a deep state of sleep-waking, or to elicit the phenomena of hearing which I had momentarily called forth. Again, I say, these instances of mesmeric action are related, not because they are complete, but because they prove power and excite hope. It may be that there exist organic impediments to Miss G's ever attaining the faculty of hearing. If so, the casual excitation of that sense by mesmerism is the more wonderful. With this case, I close the present addition to my work, an addition prompted solely by a sincere desire to lessen the prejudices against the use of mesmerism, which force themselves upon my notice on every side. I have heard a lady say, "I believe that mesmerism is the only remedy likely to cure the epileptic fits of a relation of mine, but I dare not recommend it because I doubt whether it is a permitted means of cure." When persons thus doubt whence good gifts come, to prove that good is done by a particular agent seems useless. Yet this being the sole method of demonstrating that mesmerism is no unholy thing, in this path ought its friends to persevere, hoping that, where insulated cases of benefit might seem suspicious, benefits on so large a scale must finally vanquish distrust. Granting that a few scattered miracles of healing could possibly, through divine and most mysterious permission, be wrought by an evil power, still must a systematic display of goodwill to man appear too godlike to be blasphemed by doubt. Let us beware how we turn to mockery the very words of our blessed Redeemer. The argument of the kingdom divided against itself is as valid as it was 1800 years ago, and by heaping up evidence of the benefits of mesmerism, that is, according to some, of the quantity of good done by the author of evil, we indeed reduce the question to a dilemma of absurdity. Let all, then, who love and value mesmerism, turn their powers towards demonstrating its utility on the largest possible scale, bearing in mind that the ignorance which still exists regarding this influence is the greatest cause of its being repudiated by the million. With some, it is true, this ignorance may be willful, but there are others who, in order to be convinced, need only to be instructed. There are yet many who say to me in a friendly spirit, "You must utilize mesmerism." They do not know how much it has been already utilized. And perhaps my single testimony, or that of any one person, is insufficient to give them that assurance of the fact which would take a permanent hold of their minds. Such are, at the worst, careless inquirers, and with such we cannot greatly quarrel until indeed such a flood of light shall be poured around them as shall convict those who do not know of not choosing to see. Till that time, to be strong, we must be patient, and while we cease not to insist on the higher aims of mesmerism, it is our interest to accord the fullest indulgence to the cry for making it useful in the most common and working-day sense. In advocating our great cause, forget we not that men are by nature practical utilitarians, and that, as in glancing over a work of architecture we dislike doors that unclose upon nothing, and pillars that support no weight, even ornaments of which the eye vainly demands the meaning, so and much more in regarding this mighty but as yet dimly revealed structure of mesmerism, too vast for the comprehension of a single age, this record of old time with all its exterior pomp of wonder and its internal labyrinth of vaults and chambers, with its foundations deep in darkness and its turrets lost in heaven, we are embarrassed by a feeling of the indefinite, and unable as we are to seize at once the relation and utility of so many and so complicated parts, we end by doubting impatiently the fitness and intention of the whole edifice. To reconcile the world, then, to mesmerism, we have to show that it bears upon the world and its concerns. We must make it as real as we can. We must bring it down to our commonest level, only hereafter to elevate it the more. By the force of household benefits, we must give it a claim upon our gratitude, and entwine it with our affections. And by proofs of heart rather than of head, we must demonstrate that, being neither wicked nor useless, it is of human growth and of human application. To this end, I now cast my might into the treasury of evidence that is accumulating in favor of mesmerism, with a deep regret that prejudice should yet stand in the way of so much alleviation of human suffering as it is calculated to afford, and with a humble hope that truth and time will lead to a discreet and grateful use of this wonderful gift to man. Well, that is officially the end of this book. I guess maybe I should say a couple words about what I feel now that we've got through this whole thing. A lot of it just sounds like basic hypnotism, which is a settled science, I think. And as far as the weird stuff, I'm not totally sure how much of it to believe, but when they describe people with cotton over their eyes and blindfolds tied tightly over their eyes, and these people are doing things and apparently seeing things that they shouldn't be able to do or see with blindfolds on. Uh, I I'm not quite sure how to explain that. I'm leaning toward the idea that there's something weird going on there. Something out of the norm of human experience, I guess we could say. I mean, it's possible that the people who witnessed these things were simply being hoaxed, or there's some other more natural explanation. But it sure does sound like they had people going in skeptical and seeing some demonstrations that they could not explain, and they came away believers. So that is very interesting. But I guess if you're having doubts about all this, it was part 4 of my videos, I think, chapter 5 in the book, where we described how to do all this and how to have little mesmerism parties for yourself. So go ahead and get some people together and practice these techniques and see what happens. Very strange book. Very strange stuff. My voice is dry, so I'm going to sign off. Have a good night.